Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Immigration, both into Canada and potentially out of Canada, has been a big issue in the last couple of weeks, particularly after the election of Donald Trump in the United States. And so, the Chief Executive Officer at the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, Daniel Bernhard, has joined us today because he's been very active in the media and in social media, talking about immigration as not just numbers, but something we've really got to give a lot of thought to. And so it's a pleasure to have him join us today. Daniel Bernhard, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So what is the argument you've been making?
Well, just 2 weeks ago, our organization published a report called The Leaky Bucket, which looks at the number of immigrants who are leaving Canada. And we found that this has not been a good story, that Canada's immigration retention performance has been declining for a long time. I think what this speaks to, though, is that the current debate about immigration, which is almost exclusively about the number of people coming in, actually misses a really important part of the story, namely what happens after people get here. Are they able to contribute to their full potential? And how many of them are actually staying to contribute in the long term, and how many are leaving? So we're calling for, I think, a broader conversation about how to make sure that immigration works best, not just for immigrants, but for Canada. And just focusing on the number of people coming in really doesn't do justice to the debate.
I agree. I interviewed someone that was an expert on immigration a year ago, a researcher, and they said that a lot of economic immigrants that were coming here with cash to start businesses only stayed about 18 months. Is that true?
Well, the study did show that economic immigrants and francophones, who are sort of the two most prioritized populations for immigration right now, are actually the most likely to be leaving the country. But we also found that there's an incredible amount of diversity, or just, divergence, if you like, between different regions of the country, between different categories of immigrants, between people who came as temporary foreign workers or people who came directly as permanent residents. Just for example, people who arrived here as temporary foreign workers are actually much more likely to stay in the country after becoming permanent residents than people who just came as permanent residents right away. So there's a lot of variation, but yes, the highest skilled immigration categories see the highest rates of outward migration. And this is, concerning, but also not surprising. If you are a member of a globally coveted talent pool, you also have global options. And I think this really speaks to the outdated nature of Canada's immigration narrative. We're still talking about immigration as though it's a matter of generosity on our behalf. How many people can we welcome? As though everyone's a refugee coming with $5 in their pocket. There are still people coming like that, but more and more people are not coming like that. They're actually from the very top echelons of their home societies. They have advanced education, advanced experience. We reject 96% of people who apply to become economic immigrants. That's an admission rate that's on par with Harvard University. And so those people will come, and if it's not working out, they'll do what you or me or anyone else would do. They would explore other options. They are in global demand, and Canada needs to wake up to this fact and adjust our behavior accordingly.
And so where are they going? Are they going back home? Are they going to other countries? What are they doing? They're going to the United States, and it's a brain drain?
Yeah, I think most people end up going back to the country of origin. I think there's a large desire to go to the United States just based on, high wages and stuff like that, but it's actually really hard to do. And so many people, I think, end up going back to their original country of citizenship.
Well, that's disappointing. We're investing a whole bunch of time and money and effort and bringing them here, attracting them here. It's like Harvard University. You said, they make that 96% threshold. Why can't we keep them?
Yeah, and we don't only invest money and time. We invest reputational capital. People who don't have a good experience here will go home and tell their friends, and their friends will be likely in the similar groups with similar education and similar skills. It's bad for Canada all around. When we look at why we can't keep them, there's a few reasons why. So the number one reason that newcomers give for wanting to leave the country is unaffordable housing. This should come as no surprise to anybody who lives in Canada, but it is actually, to me anyways, somewhat ironic because immigrants are being blamed more and more for lack of affordable housing, and yet it is the same lack of affordable housing that is driving people who can who are hand selected to be able to address some of Canada's most pressing needs away from the country, including people in trades, by the way, which we are actively recruiting for within the immigration system. So that is definitely something. We know that credential recognition and the inability to practice in your field of training is another one, which obviously impacts affordability and economic well-being. So I think mainly the questions are economic, but we also know from our study that there's a time variable at play. Most of the leaving happens within the first 7 years. Now, you talked about 18 months. That would be a very accelerated case, and I'm sure there is some leaving in that time. But most of it happens between 3 and 7 years after becoming a permanent resident. And so we have there a sort of danger zone, but also a window of opportunity to make sure that those early years are winning years, and that people can get on their feet a little bit faster, that they can have optimism for the future and decide that this is the place, Canada, where I would like to devote my talents and energies for the long term, so that this country can succeed instead of contributing my efforts to the success of another place.
The economic people that come with capital, they're coming with substantial capital, are they not? Like, why would they be finding that housing's expensive? I can understand that for the ordinary person, but for the rich, is it still?
Well, I think this speaks to the fact, and you'll probably see this. This is the sort of argument that the Prime Minister is making, not to be here to carry water for the Prime Minister. That's hardly my job, nor my intention. But the economy is a material fact. It's numbers and dollars and cents, but it's also a feeling. It's also a vibe. And one of the things that we found in our research is that housing affordability or unaffordability is a number one cause for wanting to leave the country among immigrants of all income brackets. That's people with household incomes of $50,000 and household incomes of $250,000. And so I think a lot of this is actually a feeling. And it's not so much even a feeling about the present, it's a feeling about the future, that they may be saying, I'm better off this year than I was last year. We see a lot of that, but I don't believe I'll be better off next year than I am now. And so this is pessimism about the future, I think, more than disappointment about the present. And that's a very hard feeling to control. But, immigrants, just like you and me, we all live here together. And obviously immigrants have certain experiences that are unique in their capacity as immigrants, but they're also just residents of Toronto, of Ontario, of Canada. And so all the negative messaging about how the economy is terrible, about how Canada is broken, about et cetera, they're seeing the stuff same as you and me. And so it's reasonable that if all Canadians are pessimistic about the future economy, which public opinion polls say that we definitely are, immigrants are pessimistic in basically the same measure. The only difference is, unlike most people born in Canada, 100% of immigrants have a passport to another place. I mean, with the exception of refugees, and so they have an option to leave, and that's a major difference. And we're seeing that in growing numbers, still small but growing. They are exercising that option to leave.
What percentage of people that are immigrating to Canada are leaving?
So it's about 20% will leave over the long term. Among Francophones, that rises to 35%. And amongst, like I said, certain categories of immigrants, economic immigrants, et cetera, it's a little bit higher. So it's been a growing trend. About, on a long-term average, it's about 1% a year, but we think that that's an undercount, and also in certain categories it's more. Also, it's fast. So in the earlier years, we're seeing numbers that are climbing to 2. In some cases, for people who were former international students, for example, upwards of 3% at the peak. So there is a large variation, but the point is the number's been growing, and it's been growing for 30 years. It's been growing steadily for 30 years, but in the most recent years that we have data for, there's been real spikes. And so this is a lagging indicator. We look in the past a couple of years just based on how the research works, which means that 2 years from now, we're going to be standing here and having this conversation about 2023 and 2024, and I can only imagine that the numbers we'll be discussing will be shocking by comparison.
Why would it be higher for Francophones? We do, I thought, a reasonable job of trying to attract Francophones, and Quebec certainly is doing a great job in trying to attract Francophones.
Yeah, excuse me. So this, I think, speaks to again some of the more difficult subjects and conversations that we need to have. In Quebec, a large part of the conversation is immigrants are not succeeding because they don't speak the language, and they can't integrate properly as a result. Well, about half of the Francophones who leave the country lived in Quebec at the time of departure, which means that the language argument just doesn't really fly. There are affordability issues, and there may be other cultural constraints that are faced. We need to dig deeper into that. The province that actually has the biggest bleed of francophones, as a proportion of the ones who come in, is Ontario. Ontario has a very, very hard time retaining francophones, and I think one of the things that we've been hearing is that many francophones come to live outside of Quebec, and they're promised that there are these official language minority communities where they can live and go to school and live their life in French. And what they find is that it's just not true. Even officially bilingual provinces like New Brunswick, for example, the government works in English and French, but basically everybody else works only in English, and so they actually find themselves to be very disappointed and needing to learn a language and work in a language that they don't know very well. That becomes dispiriting, and so either they'll pick up and move to Quebec if they can, or they'll pack up and go home. And I think that's an increasingly common phenomenon we're seeing.
At the same time as we're having these conversations, you did post a week ago, and it wasn't from you. You were reposting from The Economist magazine, but that Canada comes out tops when it comes to attracting recent graduates. That was a little bit surprising.
Well, I think this is a moderating perspective, and I think it's very important. Canada, we've been really down on ourselves recently, and that's like across the political spectrum. On the far extremes of the left, we've been saying that Canada is illegitimate and shouldn't really exist. And on the right, maybe less far extremes, and actually now more and more in the mainstream, people are saying that Canada can't do anything right. We can't get our healthcare system to work. We can't build a house. We can't build a train. The productivity's down. You name it. There's a lot of negativity in the air, and I think, though, that Canada needs to look a bit beyond itself a bit more often. And I'm not sure if that's because we as Canadians are not traveling very much, outside of Western Europe maybe, and the Sun Belt and the Caribbean. But there's a big world out there, and that world has changed a lot. On the immigration side, our failure to recognize this has meant that we still think that everybody who's coming here is leaving a terrible economic situation, and not realizing that countries like India and China and the Philippines have developed immensely in the last 30 years, and that these people now actually have a lot to teach us instead of us being so much more advanced than them. So we require some humility, which perhaps traveling abroad and seeing some of this stuff would help with. And on the other hand, though, we need to recognize that housing unaffordability is a problem in all the rich countries, that inflation is a problem in all the rich countries, that aging society and pressures on healthcare is a problem in all the rich countries. And so I think we sort of view ourselves in isolation, and that's a mistake. Relative to the rest of the world, we are still doing very well. And on the ethical, moral, whatever you want to call it side of things, when it comes to being welcoming to people from around the world, we are also doing well. I take great pleasure in the fact that when we get up and report that immigrants are leaving in record numbers, that we are greeted with shock and not applause. That still says that Canada, has a good heart and is willing to welcome people from around the world. We need to do better at it, but not everything is broken. We still do live in a beautiful, bountiful, and wealthy country, but we are missing opportunities to be able to sustain and perpetuate that wealth and lock it in for the next generation. And I think that's what we're trying to say here.
Excellent. Well said. Daniel Bernhard, thank you. We're going to take a break for some messages. We're going to come back in just 2 minutes with Daniel Bernhard. I'm going to ask him a little bit more about, are immigrants being used as scapegoats? And why is it that he and his report were greeted with applause? Sorry, not applause, but with shock rather than applause, because I think in the United States, if he had released his report, he would have been greeted by applause. So what's going on that's different here? Stay with us, everyone. We're going to be back in just 2 minutes with Daniel Bernhard talking about immigration. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is Daniel Bernhard. Our topic is immigration in Canada. He is the Chief Executive Officer at the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, and he's recently released a report called The Leaky Bucket 2024, a closer look at immigrant onward migration in Canada, that highlights that Canada is losing 1 in every 5 immigrants to onward migration over the long term. Daniel, you said that it was the report was greeted by shock, not applause, and you were helpful. You were thankful for that. Two questions: why was it shock, and why are you pleased that it's not applause?
I remain convinced that even with the rising skepticism of immigration in Canada, that Canadians are still welcoming and open-minded people. In fact, the data from Environics, which sort of is the main poll that tracks sentiment towards immigration every year, shows that yes, recently most Canadians, for the first time in a long time, the majority of Canadians think that the immigration levels are too high. But when you ask them about how the immigrants that they know are contributing to their community, etc., they actually view immigrants that they know and who are in their community very, very highly. And so it's currently right now skepticism towards immigration as a phenomenon, not immigrants as people. And that I think for me is reassuring. Canadians still think that that we are a stronger country with immigrants and with immigration. They're just starting to wonder if there's too much of it. Now, I think, however, we need to be a little bit more. We need to have a better global understanding of who is coming and why, because our perception, our debate is still informed as though immigration is a manifestation of our generosity. We can't welcome too many people. We're nice. We want to be nice. Everyone wants to come here, of course. But we can only handle so many. That's basically the nature of the debate right now. And that really assumes that the immigrants who are coming here don't have better options, or don't have other options, I should say. And what our report is showing, and I think this is the cause of the shock that you mentioned, is that many of them do have other options, and they are unafraid to exercise them. They will try to make a life in Canada. They have high hopes for their life in Canada. They have high hopes for what they're able to contribute in Canada, but it is not their only choice. And especially for the higher skilled immigrants, not only people coming with capital to start businesses, but even just people with advanced degrees in education and experience in that economic stream, they do have other choices. And our narrative doesn't reflect that. Ultimately, we need immigrants more than immigrants need us. Economic immigrants are hand-selected to be able to deal with some of Canada's most pressing challenges in healthcare, early childhood education, construction trades, you name it, cybersecurity. I mean, just ask Indigo or the Toronto Public Library about the cost of having inadequate cybersecurity expertise. These businesses were shut down, right? In case of the Toronto Public Library, for upwards of 4 months, there was no technology there. We have humongous shortages in the cybersecurity field. So we just say we're going to reduce our immigration numbers. That's great. We can do whatever we want, but the needs that immigrants are selected to fulfill do not disappear when we reduce immigration numbers, nor do they disappear when the people who are hand-selected to fulfill those needs leave the country. So we need an updated attitude here. And I think that's the shock, is that Canadians are realizing, wait a minute, what? Where would they go? Where could be better than here? And for many of these people, they do have other options. They come from the top of very unequal societies. 1.2 billion people in India, would give anything for Ontario's healthcare system. Unfortunately, we're recruiting immigrants from the 100 million at the very top of the society who have access to private healthcare of a comparable quality that you would find in the United States. So we need to wake up to the fact that if we want to be recruiting people here, we need to be working harder to retain them. They're not just fleeing desperation into our open and generous arms. Some people are, refugees are, asylum seekers are, and I'm glad that we are here for that. And they're making important contributions too. But in the economic streams, we need to wake up to who is coming and where they are coming from, and recognize that if we do not work harder to retain them, their talents and energies will leave for elsewhere.
Daniel, I appreciate that. But, a perception that lots of people have is that immigrants are a drain. They're a drain on our welfare system. They're a drain on our healthcare system. They're a drain on our pensions. They're a drain on housing, et cetera. But you're painting a very different beneficial picture. Why do we have this perception that immigrants are a drain when you're painting such a beneficial picture?
Well, the conversation around immigration and all the issues that you listed are all consumption issues. right? Consume housing, consume healthcare, consume social services. And yeah, immigrants do all of those things because they're human beings, and we do all of those things too. But we do more than those things. We go to work, we pay our taxes, we make things, we hire people. And the healthcare argument for me is the easiest one to talk about. Just 2 weeks ago, Canada invited 3,000 people with healthcare expertise to become permanent residents. We're now selecting permanent residents more and more based on specific skills, and we have specific selection pools just for those skills. There's another one for trades, etc. So those people are all going to come here, and they might get sick, I don't know, once a year and go to the hospital, but for 50 weeks a year, they'll be working in the hospital, helping the rest of us come through. So you want to take 10% of the immigrants, out of the country? Fine. You might take 10% of the people out of the hospital waiting room. You're going to take 30% of the people out of the hospital staff room, and this is where the trade just does not add up. Anybody here who has been to a hospital recently, just think about who greeted you, who checked you in, who took you to the room if you had to do that. Where was the x-ray technician from? Were they born in Canada? I will bet you that more than half were not. And that means that they're much more likely than the average population to work in these fields because they're selected for those skills. So we need to remember that immigrants don't just consume things, they produce things. They produce lots of things. And this is where the housing argument kind of is funny for me. We say, well, we don't have enough houses for all the immigrants who want to come here. But we have huge shortages in healthcare, in ECE, even in construction. I would argue that we don't have enough houses for all the immigrants that we need in order to get us past some of these big issues here. Slowing down immigration will not keep our population from aging.
But we are slowing down
our
immigration. It's a fairly major change in our immigration policy, such that I'm told that for the first time in history, we're going to have a net population decline coming up. So where did this come from? Are we scapegoating immigrants then for some problems that we've got in our society?
I think so. I do. Or I would say not scapegoating immigrants yet, thankfully. I hold Canadians in higher esteem than that, but we are scapegoating immigration for sure. We are saying that the problems in our society are not a result of our own mismanagement of our society, but simply about the number of people coming into the country. And I just think that's unrealistic. Our housing shortages have been in the works for 30 years. You cannot blame people who have been here for 30 months for that problem. Healthcare problems have been a front page news story my entire life. Are we seriously going to say that people who've come in the last year or two are really responsible for that? This is a dangerous diversion for Canada because it's going to stop us from solving the problem. We have a house, okay? We have a house here with a floor that has rotting boards in it, and there's holes in it. And if you step through, one of them, you might go all the way down, and it's dangerous. The thing should be condemned. And instead of saying we should fix the floor, what we're saying is, no, floor's fine. Just don't walk there. Just don't step there, and don't have anyone over for dinner, and just don't use this thing. No, the floor needs to be fixed. If we want to fix the healthcare system, we need to just fix the healthcare system. The population is going to age. It is continuing to age. And if we are saying that we are going to take in fewer people with healthcare expertise to deal with that aging population, we all lose. I'll give you one more story. There's a fellow I know who works in the long-term care sector in southwestern Ontario. And this guy goes around to community colleges looking for personal support workers. And he goes to the community colleges and he says, when are you going to graduate the next class of personal support workers? I will hire all of them. All of them. I will take as many as you can give, and we still don't have enough. And the population, the aging boom has only barely begun. So we have these needs. They will not go away. We do not have enough Canadians right now to be able to deal with many of those needs. And so, absent some sort of miracle in birth rates, or a bunch of Canadians deciding to get into personal support work, we are going to need people who want to come here and contribute in these different ways, and we're going to need to retain them when they're here.
So what's gone on? Because a couple of years ago, we were talking about, significant increases in immigration. We were talking about potentially 100 million people in Canada. The statistic that I heard is that, 10, 15 years ago, we had 5 working people for every 1 person that was a retiree. And now we're going to have in the future 2 people working for every one that's a retiree. And that's not sustainable. We need more people to do the jobs that you've been talking about, but also just to pay the taxes to finance our society with the baby boom all aging. So, a couple of years ago, population increase and immigration was the solution. And all of a sudden it's become the problem. Why?
Well, as I've been saying the last week, we live in a democracy, which means that some of the time, at least, public opinion becomes public policy. And that's clearly what happened here. There's been a growing drumbeat for about 2 years that says our housing problems, our healthcare problems are basically just immigration problems. I don't agree with that, just factually, but that is now the mainstream opinion. And so the government's responding to that. They are responding to that pressure, and they understand that, the most important thing about our immigration system is not our ability to select people or settle them. It's actually the public consensus around immigration, which does not exist in many other parts of the world. And so I suspect, I haven't spoken to Minister Miller about this, but I suspect that his main concern was not trying to politicize immigration anymore and trying to do whatever he can to maintain broad public consensus for this idea. And if that means slowing down the pace a little bit, so be it, because if the consensus breaks, the consequences become much worse. I think that's really what's been going on. The government's responding to the public here, and the public is responding to things that superficially make sense. We don't have enough housing. We don't have enough space for the number of people who are coming. We have not been able to build it fast enough. But you know what? I'm in Toronto. Rents are declining. Condos are empty. Sales are plummeting because, all the speculators are getting out of it. And even though we think that we're going to have lower housing construction requirements because the population will be shrinking, CMHC just reported 2 weeks after the immigration levels were reduced that housing starts in Ontario are plummeting to new lows. So there are more variables at play here than just the number of people coming in. And if that's all we focus on, we're going to be deflecting attention away from what we should be looking at, which is, are we doing a good job of governing this place, of running this place, and of planning for our future? Here's the thing that drives me nuts, Brian. We don't have enough space. We don't have enough this. We don't have enough that. Look at Canada. Is anyone going to seriously look me in the eye and tell me that this place is full? We live in a huge empty landmass that is completely abundant. We need to have a bigger horizon here, and not every immigrant needs to settle in Toronto, but there's no need why we shouldn't think of building new cities, of growing, of continuing to evolve as a country, as a civilization. There is a bright, bright future ahead of us. If we are just thinking about housing pressures that are happening right now, we're going to make mistakes. Population planning is a long-term game. Infrastructure planning is a long-term game. And we have so much space and so much wealth and so much opportunity that I think we're taking a very short-sighted view.
I agree. But no one's out there, other than maybe you, talking about the positives, are they? No one in politics is.
Yeah, I think there are very few people talking about the positives. And look, I'm not a politician, which I guess helps. I'm not looking to ask anyone to vote for me. But I think what we need to do is not. I'm not here advocating for we ought to have this many people or that many people, which is something I get asked a lot. Okay, well, what's the right level of immigration? Do you want to have, 500,000, a million a year, 2 million a year? What I'm saying is we should take a rational view and view immigration as part of a bigger economic strategy. So I often compare the immigration department to the HR department for the country. That's what it is. And the HR department for your company finds people to fill roles, but it doesn't really decide what those roles are and what they ought to be. And it's not responsible for everything that happens in the country after they get here. I would love for a government to stand up and say, and I've invited the minister, I've shared this with the Minister of Immigration, I've shared this with the opposition leader's office, Mr. Poilievre's office. I will talk to anybody who wants to talk to me about this, to stand up in Parliament and say, we have a goal that 95% of Canadians will have access to a family doctor by 2034. 10 years from now. We have this many doctors today. We're going to have this many retirements. We're going to graduate this many from our medical schools, and therefore we need that many left, and we're going to make that up through immigration. that it's part of an integrated, it's one plank of an integrated strategy to achieve goals for Canada. Immigration is not just a net benefit just by itself. I think we need to do a better job of not explaining to Canadians, but actually planning for immigration and situating it in our own minds as leaders, in public opinion, but also the people in government, of saying, all right, we want to do certain things. Immigration can help us do those things, and we should be explaining it as part of a bigger project, whether that's in healthcare or construction or any other field. It's only one part of the puzzle. It's only one piece of it, and we should situate it always within the whole.
So I think everything you've just said is what was the immigration policy and strategy a couple of years ago that took our immigration levels from where they were to the increased amount that led to this comment about 100 million people in Canada eventually. What happened? Did we just not sell it?
I don't ever think it. I mean, in theory it was, but the immigration system is now so complicated that I think it's very, very difficult to say, what needs it's fulfilling. In the 90s, there were 8 economic immigration programs in Canada, 4 for Quebec and 4 for the rest of Canada. Today, there are over 100 ways to become a permanent resident, okay? It is incredibly, incredibly complicated. And the temporary streams, there are hundreds of them. It is every little stakeholder and their uncle has some little tiny slice of it. And so I think that makes it very, very difficult for the government to actually have a coherent message about how immigration is supporting our economy and our social needs, because it's just so fragmented. It's just so fragmented. They are trying to do these little pieces, but it really is in bits and pieces. I think a simplification really is in order, like a radical simplification of the system, so that Canadians can make sense of it. But it's not just a fault of Canadians' understanding. A complicated system is complicated, and the bureaucrats also, I think, have a difficult time meeting some sort of cohesive unitary goal when they're administering 1 million of these little streams. I think it's more than just a communications problem.
We're chatting tonight with Daniel Bernhard, who is the CEO of the group that has just released a major report on immigration. And I think it's really kind of an interesting report. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship. And the report was on understanding our immigration levels, and that 20%, 1 in 5 immigrants actually leave the country. And he said that people greeted his report with shock, and thank God they didn't greet it with applause. Stay with us, everyone. We're going to come back in 2 minutes, and I'm going to ask Bernhard a couple of questions about, is some of this caused by what's going on in the United States, and what's going to happen in the future if Donald Trump kicks out a whole bunch of immigrants and they want to come to Canada. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. The topic tonight is immigration. Daniel Bernhard is my guest. He's the Chief Executive Officer at the Institute for Canadian Citizenship. Daniel, let's take a step back for a second, if we could. You've got a fascinating background. You have been for 3 years the CEO of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, but before that, you were the Executive Director of the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting. That's a bit of a change from broadcasting to citizenship. And before that, you were president of something called Mushroom Cloud, a public benefit consulting company. And then I got to ask you, fascinating, you've got a master's of political economy from the University of Cambridge and a bachelor's with the London School of Economics in political science. And I understand that your dissertation prize won first-class honors. So I got to ask you, what was your dissertation on?
I wrote a dissertation about conflict, and this was the early 2000s, and September 11th was still very fresh in everyone's mind, and I was wondering about how people from around the world who never met each other could hate each other so much, and the basic answer was they tell stories about each other, and when they meet each other, those stories break down, and so keeping them apart is actually part of the strategy for anyone who wants to foment conflict. And I think actually a similar thing is true when we're talking about immigration today. As a concept, everyone says too much immigration, but then when we ask them, what about the immigrants you know. They say, oh yeah, they're all great people. They're working hard. They're making contributions. So I think there's some similarity there. On the broadcasting and immigration side, look, my parents immigrated to Canada, and Canada's given us everything. Has given us everything, and I've always been extremely grateful to be Canadian, very proud of it. And in my career, working with charities and foundations and government agencies, improving and strengthening Canada has always been really the central animating principle for me. So working in the media space, making sure that people like you still have an opportunity to talk about what's going on in Canada, that we have our own culture, our own stories, our own identity, our own point of view. That for me, was a job done in service of Canada, and the same is true of making sure that we can retain people who want to strengthen our country and play for our team. So I see them as being perhaps more linked than you might think. But yeah, I've been a public benefit guy. That's what I do. Charity case.
A charity case. Your dissertation about why people hate each other. I gotta ask you, because it's been something that's been really bothering me, about what the impact of what's going on in the U.S. you think might be having on the political attitudes, the public policy, the public attitudes in Canada in regards to immigration. I, for business, have recently come back from 2 trips to the U.S. And I was in Florida, and your comments about the healthcare system. I was in a seniors residence. And probably a third of the staff are from Haiti, and their English wasn't great. They were speaking French amongst themselves, certainly. And then in all the restaurants, everywhere you go, Spanish is the language of all the people that are serving you, and not that they're immigrants, not that they're illegal immigrants, but certainly they are not long-term Americans per se. I was in Texas, same thing. I was in Vegas, same thing. And then I was in Kentucky, and I was surprised in the middle of the United States. And, same thing. The unemployment rate in the United States is lower than it is in Canada. And all these immigrants, legal or illegal, appear to be contributing to society and working. And I wonder what the heck's going to happen to the economy if all these people are encouraged or forced to leave. Trump is talking about 20 million people. I was trying to put it in perspective. I think we had, 500,000 that were supposed to come to Canada, and maybe 1 million that actually did, which would in US terms times 10 make that 5 to 10 million people that would have arrived in the United States. So our immigration from a per capita standpoint is dramatically greater than it is in the United States. But if you believed, some of the people on Fox, everyone that comes to the United States, at least illegally, I guess, is a rapist and a murderer. What's going on? And, is what's going on having an impact on public perception in Canada?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And you asked about the connection between broadcasting and immigration. This is one of them. A country so big as Canada is an idea. It exists between our ears. Most Canadians, across great distance will never meet each other, and yet we retain a unity of identity. And one of the reasons why I was concerned about, so many of our media organizations closing down is because, we'll just consume more and more American media than we already do. The difference is that in the United States, the situation is actually really different than it is here. Canada has benefited from geography forever, basically. That has allowed us to be very selective about immigration. We are surrounded by 3 oceans and the Imperial Death Star. That means that we can be very, very choosy about who comes here. You can't really walk from San Salvador to Toronto. It's very hard to do. But you can walk from San Salvador to Dallas. And so that is a major, major difference. In the United States, the percentage of people who are coming in irregularly is way, 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 way bigger than it is in Canada. It's not even close. It's not even funny. Whereas here, it's much more managed and people are much more selected and approved. But if we're just listening to the U.S. story and we think, well, it's all the same, then we're going to make mistakes, and we're going to make mistakes. So I I think this is definitely part of it. The vilification that's happened of immigrants in the United States is something that has definitely rubbed off on Canada, and has caused us to really misunderstand who is coming here. They're coming under very, very different circumstances than people swimming or wading across the Rio Grande.
What's going to happen if there's mass deportations in the United States? And is Canada going to be the subject to a whole bunch of illegal immigration?
I don't know. I mean, the famous philosopher Yogi Berra apparently said, "I hate to make predictions, especially about the future." So I just think that the immigration, the politics of immigration are going to hurt Canada no matter what. That there will be arguments that Canada is, a loose border that needs to be sealed, or these kinds of things, and so we will, I'm sure, be labeled as an enemy of the United States immigration policy at some point. We also have to think about what's going to happen if there are people who are persecuted down there for. I'm thinking about abortion providers, for example, or people who are on the political left, who may be subject to violence in the United States, which is, I think, not actually very far off any longer in certain places. What happens when one of those people who claims persecution by a Republican governor, for example, shows up in Windsor and says, "I'm a refugee and I'm not going to be treated fairly over there in the justice system"? What are we going to do then? So the Trump administration is going to drop a bomb into a whole bunch of stuff, and that will affect Canada, from trade to which is just the movement of stuff, to immigration, which is the movement of people, and who knows whether he'll go through with it or not. But there's one other thing I do want to mention, which is Canada's looming deportation boom. The net population decline that you mentioned earlier in the show, the government is saying that reduced immigration levels will cause the population to shrink a little bit. And one assumption there is that 1.2 million people who are currently in the country on temporary visas, those are international student visas or postgraduate work permits for students who have finished and are working, temporary foreign workers, not just in agriculture, but including people in very high wages, cybersecurity, etc., construction supervisors, that they're just going to leave, that their visas are not going to be renewed, and they're just going to go. And well, what happens if they don't? So the illegal underground thing, that non-status, undocumented, whatever word you want to use, a big part of that is that there are people who are working here, who have jobs, who have no pathway to be permanent residents. Many of them have Canadian children, etc., and they're going to have to be removed from the country, and we're not prepared for that at all. So whilst the U.S. is something that we want to look at all the time and go, "Oh man, what a circus down there, look at those people," we should also keep one eye on ourselves and on our own situation. And this is a real time bomb that, in the next 12 to 36 months, as these visas progressively expire and are not renewed, it's going to be an interesting situation to see how many of those people actually leave and what the government of Canada decides to do with the ones who don't.
You raised the students, the foreign students. Let's talk about that for a second. Several different post-secondary institutions have announced that they have to cut programs, significant cuts in programs, because of the restrictions on bringing foreign students in. And there has been a lot of bad press about this huge influx in foreign students and housing for those students, and that it's a way that a lot of the universities have been able to finance themselves. What's the analytics on foreign students in Canada? Are they beneficial, or are they being taken advantage of by private colleges, or what?
I think that the foreign students have definitely been taken advantage of, and I'd go almost as far as to say that they've been abused. Many have been charged, $100,000 for a diploma in basket weaving that was sold to them as a means of coming to Canada and to be able to stay and work and obtain citizenship eventually, and that's just not true. And so now their entire family, remember, $100,000 from countries like India and Bangladesh, Nigeria, where the per capita income is like $20,000, the household income is so low. That's a ton of money, and that money's been wasted and thrown down the toilet for education that is not going to have much market value here. People who arrived as international students, even when they become permanent residents, are 3 times more likely to leave than people who arrived here on a work permit and came straight into work. Just to give you a sense of it.
Sorry, say that again. So if you come on a work permit, you're 3 times more likely to stay.
Yeah.
Than a student, than a foreign student. So the foreign students, they come and they go.
Even after becoming permanent residents, they are choosing to leave, which I think reflects the fact that the education that they're receiving is not preparing them for success in Canada and not preparing them to fill needs in the workforce. The colleges and universities, and I should say, I know you talked about private colleges, 29 of the top 30 institutions granting international student visas are public colleges and universities. So this is not just like fly-by-night operations. These are, organizations like Sheridan College now, which is announcing that they're going to have to shutter huge amounts of their operation as a result of these changes. I think that the international students program has been a real tragedy, and let me tell you why. Because over 60% of these people are coming and studying some form of business credential, which is not needed. We have no shortage of these types of skills in Canada. And so we're taking their money for an education that has very little market value. And also they were sold now they're being told that they're not going to get work permits, etc. Well, they were attracted here, and the government website, I don't know if it still does, but it did until recently. For international students, the federal government website had a 4-word tagline: come, study, work, stay. So when we see international students who are now saying, I'm leaving and I'm upset and Canada should let me stay, and everyone says, you're entitled, no one promised you should stay. Technically, it's true. They had no guarantee of staying, but the government strongly implied it. But let me give you the alternative future. There is another way that we could have done this. If all of these students were studying carpentry and nursing, I don't think anyone would care. I don't think anyone would care. We'd take double the number. We'd say, thank you very much for coming, and you have jobs, and we're glad you're here. There are 2 main things that keep immigrants from being able to contribute fully to the economy: foreign credential recognition issues and lack of Canadian experience. People who study in Canadian educational institutions sidestep both of those barriers. They have a Canadian credential, so it doesn't require any foreign recognition nonsense. And if they're young enough, there is no expectation that they will have any experience, Canadian or otherwise, and so they can go straight into the workforce, which means that if we were studying students, if we were selecting students specifically for areas like healthcare, like early childhood education, where we have shortages, they would be very welcome. They would go straight into the workforce. They would be meeting real needs in the Canadian economy and society. And our education system would be this incredible pathway for ensuring that immigrants are ready to contribute
but
at the standard we expect. But you've got to assume
that those post-secondary institutions are creating the programs that are in demand.
They're creating programs that are in demand under the false assumption that if you graduate with anything, you will get past the immigration point system. Like, they're just playing this immigration game and not an education game when it comes to the foreign students. That's the difference.
So foreign students aren't the problem. The problem is that Canada Immigration and the universities aren't working together to figure out what the programs are that we should be enrolling foreign students in.
There is, yeah, I mean, they're starting to do this now a little bit, but it's too little and far too late. In March, when the federal government announced the first ever cap on international students, they did not cap them based on what they're studying. They just capped them based on where they are. So like, okay, Ontario, you keep doing the same thing, but you do a little less of it. Nova Scotia, you do the same thing, but a little less of it. They didn't change the character of the system much. I believe, and I've told this to the minister, I've told this to the leader of opposition, that we should be selecting students just like we select economic immigrants based on their course of study to make sure not only that they are able to do something that Canada needs, but for their own interest. If you graduate with skills that have no value in the marketplace, you suffer. And this is not working out well for the students either. And I think Canada is really missing an opportunity here.
We're chatting tonight with Daniel Bernhard about immigration. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Interesting, fascinating, and very topical conversation. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I'm having I think, a really topical and interesting conversation with Daniel Bernhard. He's the Chief Executive Officer at the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, and I was really interested in having him on because he's recently issued a report on immigration in Canada that I think created a lot of shock, frankly, because he said that 20% of immigrants actually leave. And I think people were surprised by that. Daniel, if I appointed you Minister of Immigration, what would you do?
I would run. No, I think that, look, what I would say to Canadians right now is that, and to all of your listeners, if you're worried about the levels of immigration that are happening in the country, if you think that Canada is admitting too many immigrants to the country, I don't think you're a racist. I don't think you're stupid. I don't think you're bigoted or prejudiced. I understand the thinking, and I understand that if you are pessimistic about the country's ability to grow the pie, so to speak, that it sort of makes sense to reduce the number of people who are nibbling at it. But the fact is that we have needs in this country. There is a daycare next to my house where my own son attends. And until very recently, there was one room there that was empty. They couldn't staff it. And it's a unionized place that pays $32 an hour with benefits and stuff like that. It's not some sort of fly-by-night operation, and they still couldn't staff it. And that's like, 24 moms who can't go back to the workforce, who can't pay taxes, who can't develop, who can't advance in their careers. Immigration is not just about the immigrant. Immigration is about all of us. And so we should be thinking about growth and about wealth and about how immigration factors into it. But remember, it's something that's for all of us. It's not just for the compassion of immigrants. It is for each and every one of us, not only when we get old or when we need to be taking care of our kids, but to be able to benefit from the knowledge and experiences of people from around the world, from countries that know how to do stuff we don't know how to do, that can teach us things that can keep Canada fresh and alive. So we should really remember this is about our self-interest, and it's not that more is better or anything like that, but we do have objective needs here that are not being fulfilled. And so I would encourage Canadians to be open to that and to encourage their governments to say, how are we going to fix these needs? Immigration is part of it, but I want the whole plan, and I want to know how immigration is going to contribute to the greater good.
Daniel Bernhard, thank you so much for joining us. I tend to agree with you wholeheartedly. I think immigration has been a very strong net positive for Canada. I think that foreign credential recognition is important. I think that integrating people into society is critical, including them, getting them involved in our society and to become contributing members of society, I think is critical. I don't think we do a good enough job in that regard. And I do think that some of the American media and public opinion negativity toward immigration has washed over into Canada, and I think that's a negative. It is different because it's, as you point out, more economic legal immigration than illegal immigration. And so I think that the immigration that we do get in Canada is very different than the immigration potentially that they get in the United States. That said, I think the immigration in the United States is still a very strong net positive. And I think that too often immigration and immigrants have been used as scapegoats. They certainly, I think, have been in the last U.S. federal election. And so I think we need people like you that are putting forward the facts, putting forward the arguments, putting forward the truth in regards to how Canada needs immigrants and immigration, and that our society is better for it. And so I really appreciate you joining us tonight, sir. Thank you.
Thanks for your time, Brian.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 a.m. You can stream me online, even from India or Pakistan or wherever you might be if you're thinking about coming to Canada at www.saga960am.ca. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Good night.